Thank you so much, Vanessa. Much appreciated. And thank you everyone for joining. It really is a privilege to be with you all. So thanks for extending both the invitation and also thank you so much for opening up the time. So my name is Oswald Kuyler. I'm the Managing Director of DSI and I work at the International Chamber of Commerce. I have a few slides for you today that I'll walk through over the next 20 minutes before handing over to Randall. Again, please do post your questions or comments in the chat because it's really the hope and dream is that we have some form of interactivity at the end. So please do that. The International Chamber of Commerce, for those of you who don't know, is the institutional representative of over 45 million companies globally. And one of the key takeaways that I generally try to leave people with is that when you think about 45 million organizations, we're not there specifically representing one industry over another, but actually we have quite a diverse portfolio. Very similarly, if you think about those 45 million companies that we represent, it also ranges from really large multinational organizations to actual MSMEs. In fact, the majority of our members are actually small enterprises, which is fantastic. And our mission really is to try and make sure that business works for all of these businesses and that we remove as much friction points as we possibly can. The final point on this slide that I would like to leave you with is we're also over 100 different countries globally. So quite a diverse view and region. So we're not there specifically to try and elevate one region over another, but try to enable world's businesses across all of the regions globally and remove some of those frictions. So if we go on to the next slide, what is the DSI and what is it that we're doing at the International Chamber of Commerce? We firmly believe that the digitization of trade is not something that's a question of if, but rather when. And so generally when we look at this question of can we digitize trade or when can we digitize trade, the question is it going to take us another 50 years to do that? Or is it something that's potentially possible within the next 10 years? And the reason we ask that question, a lot of people think, well, 50 years, that sounds a bit crazy. But when you think about, for example, the digitization of title documents in trade, over the last 22 years, we've basically gone from not many to 0.5% of electronic bills of lading being digitally produced in the world today. So that gives you a sense of progress. And that's also in the middle of, a pandemic. So we know digitization is ticking up, but we also know it's not ticking up fast enough. And we want to see how do we accelerate that process so that we can all reap the benefits of quality, reliable, accessible data and all of the use case benefits that that ultimately leads to. One of the things that I loved about what Maria mentioned also is not reinventing the wheel or using some of the foundations that exist. And that's one of the key things that we had to do when we started the initiative is understand what is it that we're actually going to do and how do we ensure that we actually respect the infrastructure that's already available globally. So our very first core principle was how do we reuse rather than recreate? A lot of people, when they approach digitization of trade or supply chain processes, think immediately that somehow some of the existing infrastructure or the existing standards are not necessarily sufficient. And we've taken a completely different route. We've gone, potentially there's some other challenges, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. We've also, from a principles perspective, ensured that we need to consider all approaches. We need to ensure that these standards and the mechanisms, the way in which we can digitize should be open to all. Whether you're a large multinational mining company that can potentially afford to have multiple systems to digitize trade, or whether you're a small company who goes, I just want to be able to digitize my trade documentation without necessarily going into all of the complexities of some of the technologies on offer. And the very last item that I'll highlight here on this slide is that we needed to enhance capacity and capability. So for example, when we think about how do we harmonize legal frameworks globally, how do we make sure it's legal to transition from paper to electronic? How do we go from a world 12 months ago where there were a few handfuls of people focusing on that to really mobilizing the business community to work in partnership with organizations like UNCITRAL to help solve and accelerate that challenge and make sure that it's not just quantity of people, but the capabilities. So for example, when we have legal conversations, we have the lawyers in the room. When we have technology conversations, we have the technologists, etc. So this gives you an indication. We want to accelerate the digitization of global trade. We want to reuse as much as possible, make sure it's accessible, and also ensure that we have the appropriate people globally contributing to the process to help with that acceleration journey. So on the next slide, what you'll see is basically 5 key areas. So what we did between September and December last year was we asked a lot of our stakeholders, how can we actually contribute? And the reality was it kind of boiled down to some of these core things. The first was that people had this view that there was a lack of coherent standards. And one of the things we realized immediately was that there was an opportunity for the ICC to actually advocate for the adoption of a lot of the standards that already existed. When we spoke to fintechs or organizations and we said, have you adopted some of these standards already to start removing the frictions in your supply or trade processes? The answer was generally, we haven't, and we didn't know it existed, and thank you so much for telling us. So we needed to ensure that that got solved. And then secondly, as people were producing new standards, that they were compatible and they were using the same language to the rest of the ecosystem around them. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The other 2 items I would highlight on this slide is we needed to ensure that we remove some of the legal uncertainties. It's great that a lot of information can be digitized without us necessarily having to worry about regulations stepping in and hindering that process. But the reality was that in a lot of countries globally, most of the large trade nations, you still required physical records. You still required that title document to be physicalized when you go through the port, etc. And so how do we ensure that we can remove that challenge from the business community so that we can see us not just progressing from getting bills of lading and warehouse receipts digitized, but ultimately unlocking all of the other benefits that would follow from having access to quality and reliable data. And the final one I would add on this is to also ensure that the rules are quite well known. So ICC, everyone's familiar mostly with Incoterms. How do we ensure that we can work with the global society to figure out, well, what is Incoterms for this new digital world? Who's accountable and responsible at which points as we go through the digitalization journey? So when we go into the next slide, boom, 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 there we go. What you'll see is a lot of different logos, and this might seem quite complex, especially for a lot of people in the business community who's just trying to figure out, well, how do I digitize the information within my ecosystem? But the reality is these are all the capabilities that we have on Earth producing absolutely great, whether it's standards, rules, guidelines, or practices that can actually help the business community succeed. And our position, the way we looked at this and said, how can we contribute, was making sure that there was interoperability between even the work that's being done on the screen. So I'll use one example, but I can probably spend an hour with multiple examples. But when you think a bit about, for example, organizations using letters of credit to trade, as a part of the letter of credit process, you need to present both commercial invoices and title documents like bills of lading to go through the process. So how do we ensure that as people are producing these new standards on how to digitize EBL, so organizations like DCSA and BIMCO, leveraging the great work from UNCFAC, how do we ensure that that is compatible, for example, with the rules and practices, the EUCP rules and practices that the ICC has produced? So again, it's making sure that all of these get harmonized, making sure that they complement each other and that they don't cause friction, and also making sure that, again, the business community know they exist, know that there's a lot of standards that you can already adopt in your operating model that's already going to start ultimately creating results. So on the next slide, when we think about how we achieve that, again, it's not just something one single organization can do. And to Maria and Vanessa's point, this is all about hyper collaboration. And so one of the things that we had to do and how we had to construct ourselves around this challenge was to say, how do we make sure it's not just our voice driving what we do? And so we have two advisory boards. One is an industry advisory board. The second one is a legal reform board. But the industry advisory board have great leaders on it, like Miguel from GS1, that actually help sit in a group, in a room with people with SWIFT, IPCSA, BIMCO, FIATA, DCSA, where we all sit together and figure out, well, how do we actually achieve the desired results that we want to achieve? And the role of that board is fundamentally to ensure that we focus on the things that matter most. In that group, we have people from the business community who can give us an indication as to both A, what are the frictions that they are experiencing already that ecosystem participation can help solve. And then secondly, what are some of the challenges where in the future, we know that we can extract value in the next financial year, but ultimately to achieve scale, especially around use cases like ESG, we need some new mechanisms to actually achieve that. So next slide, please. So here's a view of some of those members. And the key takeaway that I would love to leave you with is that if you think about this group, it's a lot of the standards organizations kind of working together, but we also have 4 different communities. The one is mining, and so you'll see a lot of the miners here, high margin, less complex supply chains, and you'll also see some retailers, which is lower margin, higher complex supply chains, and then we have the carrier industry also represented. And the reason we wanted those 3 is because we've seen a lot of successes in digitization and commodities, but we haven't necessarily seen that translate through all the way to retail when it comes to, again, documents of title. And so how do we ensure that as we're approaching the standards problem and we're trying to figure out who can ultimately solve what and which mechanism, it works for both of those different types of organizations. There's a few additional members that's joined since the slide, but you can, on our website, you'll be able to get some additional insight into that. Next slide, please. So capitalizing on growing momentum. So while the industry advisory board is all focused on how do we make sure that we're collectively working together as a global community, ensuring that the standards exist that is required to digitize, what we're also doing is working with UNCITRAL to further accelerate the adoption of the UNCITRAL model for electronic transferable records. We need to ensure that globally, we can help our companies ensure that they can transition from paper to electronic, and when they get to that discharge port, or if they are busy trading that title document, that it's legal and it's based not on private law, but actually on regulatory support. You'll see a few new countries. So while only 1 country on earth adopted the model law about 12 months ago, or a little bit more, we've now hit 5 in total. I think we're at 7 actually today, and you'll see this number grow. And the way I look at it is it's similar to e-commerce. UNCITRAL released the e-commerce model law in 1996, and we can see what the growth rate of both adoption of that model law, but also e-commerce was over time. And the model law for electronic transferable records is going to be fairly similar. We'll see how both the adoption rate goes up and that number of electronic bills of lading being produced also going up at the same rate, which is quite exciting. Next slide, please. So these are some of the foundational pillars of execution. This is some of the areas that we're looking into. And again, when I say we, don't see it as ICC. This is, again, the collective community with organizations like GS1, Glyph, etc., taking the lead in some of these areas. We need to make sure that the data is standardized to some degree. We need to ensure that there's standards for how to produce documents. We do need to ensure that when we have different fields and different document types, that there's some form of harmonization between those. And that's why we have data and documents separately. And then we need to ensure that from a technological point of view, there's a way for us to integrate securely and in a trusted way with each other. We also need to ensure that we fundamentally modernize the rules that are out there for trade, whether those are the rules around certificate of origin issuance, whether those are EUCP, all of these it's almost like an acronym soup of the amount of rules out there. And we need to ensure that they also transition into this modern world. And finally, we need to see digitization. We both need to express and help businesses understand, well, what's the value so that they can allocate the capital, do the operating model adjustments, and ultimately achieve the results. And also we need to work with multilateral banks so that we can ensure we can actually digitize our ports, get the appropriate capability and capital to help various different countries on earth to actually go on that digitization journey. Next slide, please. This is a high-level overview of just the detail behind that. I won't go into too much more detail. What I will leave you with is, you'll see we have a 5-year rolling plan. What is the ambition? What should businesses expect from the global community in 5 years? And what are we trying to deliver in the next year? The reason we want to share this level of transparency is to help businesses actually plan. And again, it's important not just to produce the standards, but ensure that from a business community point of view, we know what's coming so we can plan for it, allocate capital, and adjust operating models. Next slide, please. Thank you. So you'll see there's a link on the slide over here. This is our website. What we've done on the website, it's open, there's no membership. And fundamentally, we're just trying to connect you to all of these standards. So if you're someone from a governmental organization, you can go onto the website. We share all of the data that we have around different countries adopting the model law, the process they've gone through, guides on that, etc. If you're a business, we provide you with insights on what are some of the standards that are available, what are the foundational standards you can use, what are the new ones that are coming, again, just to help businesses actually digitize. A lot of people ask me, why is 2021, 2022 different to 5 or 6 years ago when everyone was talking about blockchain? And the last thing I'll say is, I'll leave you with this is the first time that I've seen in my career journey, all of these organizations globally working together, understanding we all need to be humble in the process. Each of us have our space, but collectively we can solve this challenge of moving off paper onto electronic. So thank you so much for your time. It's now my privilege and honor to ask Randall to join us. Thank you, Randall.